I am so excited because this video is another collab with Kris O'Neil from Sew the Distance. I love these collab videos with Kris, and we have done two in the past. I will link those down in the description. I am so excited for this one though because it is different from our past collabs. So you're probably wondering, how is it different? Well, this one is a competition and we are trying to see who can make a quilt for the best price, and I love a good competition. I love to win. So hopefully I do. I don't know, we'll see though. All right, so what am I even blabbing about, right? Okay, so to make this competition fair, we are using the same quilt pattern. So here is the quilt that we are doing. It is jelly roll friendly, and it is a Moda pattern that is free on their website. It is quadrangle. It was so much fun to do. We are both using a free pattern, and then we are just trying to make this quilt for the best price. So I'm going to kind of talk about how I go about trying to make a quilt for a good price on a budget or something like that, because fabric is pricey. All the stuff that goes into quilts can really add up. We're using the same pattern to try to make this fair, and that is a good way to go about making a quilt on a budget. There are so many patterns out there that are free, and while I love supporting pattern designers and purchasing patterns, sometimes you can find patterns that are free. So my suggestion would be though, is when you're looking for a pattern, since it is free, you're able to download it before you purchase any of the fabric requirements. Look through the pattern and make sure it's something that you understand and are able to do, because you don't want to grab all the fabric for a pattern and then realize the pattern isn't something you're comfortable making and you have all this fabric that's specific for something that you're unable to use. All right, so another tip for you if you are wanting to make a quilt on a budget is to shop the fabrics that you've already have. So I know for me, I can tend to have a lot of fabric, and not just fabric that is in yardage still or a fat quarter still, but I have a lot of fabric that is scraps from projects that I've used before. Before we go on, I'm going to tell you that I decided to make this quilt scrappy, and I decided to make it in Christmas fabric. So last year I did a lot of Christmas projects and I had a lot of Christmas fabric left over from that. So let me show you my quilt. And I'll be sure to put up some close-up pictures for it as well. Now, the reason I felt comfortable going scrappy with this quilt is because of all of the areas that have sashing here. So my tip for you would also be, if you're using scraps, to look for a pattern that has a lot of sashing and cornerstones. This is a good way to kind of make sure everything all ties together in the quilt, because you'll have that consistency of the sashing and the cornerstones throughout the quilt, and it'll really help to unify everything and bring it all together. So if you do plan on making a scrappy quilt, and maybe you're not usually comfortable working with scraps because you don't like having a lot of different patterns and colors all trying to come together, that is a good tip that I like to look for in a pattern, is having that sashing there. All right, so my next tip would be to look for sales. Keep an eye out on those sales on different fabric shops that you like to shop online. So for me, I love to shop for fabric. I would prefer to always go to my local quilt shop and shop for fabric because I can see everything in person. It makes it a lot easier to make sure you're getting a color and that you're really looking for if you're looking for something specific. However, since I have been buying fabric for a long time now, there are certain designers that I kind of know I'll like their color scheme. I'm probably gonna like this color because it's one they use a lot. So sometimes I am comfortable purchasing certain fabrics online. Now, one thing that I do always look for, and would be a tip for you as well, is if there is a really big sale on fabric that you often use a lot. Like I tend to use a lot of white fabric and a lot of gray fabric and a lot of cream fabric. Those tend to go into backgrounds a lot on my quilts. So whenever I see a sale on those, I will typically buy a decent amount of it. Recently, well, it actually wasn't recently, I thought it was recently, I bought a big 8-yard pack of white fabric from the Missouri Star Quilt Company. It's the fabric I used here. I bought it last year at Christmas. They were having a big sale. So I got that fabric for $5 a yard, and it's what I used here in this quilt. So on this pattern, that was 2.5 yards of fabric for the background. I got this fabric into this quilt for about, what was that, $12.50, which isn't really bad for that amount of fabric, especially since I wasn't spending anything else on this quilt, which I'll talk more about later. So if you are looking to try to make quilts on a budget, that would be another tip of mine, is to keep a lookout for sales. Now, what I'm really excited to show you is the back of this quilt. So that would be another tip that I would like to give you as well if you're trying to make a quilt on a budget, is to not be afraid to piece the back of your quilt. The fabric for the back of your quilt could be a huge part of your budget that goes into a quilt. It's a lot of fabric depending on the size of the quilt that you're making. So if you have some fabric in pretty sizable pieces left over from another quilt or another pattern, sometimes I can end up buying some fabric for a pattern that requires a certain amount of fabric, and maybe the way I cut it was a little bit different than how the designer had planned for it to be cut, and I ended up with a lot more. Sometimes that can happen. So if you have a lot of fabric left over that you're not planning to use on anything specific, maybe think about piecing your background. Not your background, the back of the quilt. The way I did this was I put all of the fabric that I was planning on using up on my design board, but you could lay it out on the floor and kind of see how it might come together. And what I like to do so that it kind of looks uniform and looks like it was intentional is I made sure all my directional fabric was all facing one direction. And then I also tried to put pieces that could flow through areas, like this gray through here. I had this piece that is very nice and directional that goes through the center of the quilt. And it actually ended up kind of mimicking the front of the quilt because it looks a little plaid-like on the back. I'm really happy with how it turned out. And sometimes I may even put this on my couch facing the other way because I'm pretty happy with how the back turned out. Having that piece back of the quilt saved me a lot of money on purchasing fabric for the back of the quilt. Now, if you don't feel comfortable piecing the back of the quilt, something else you could look into is maybe, purchasing a sheet for the back of the quilt. Sometimes you can get a flat sheet for a really good price at a really good quality, especially if you find some sheets on sale. That's a way you could go as well. Now, for the binding on this quilt, I did just use scraps left over from the rest of the quilt, and I love a nice scrappy binding. It works really well on this quilt since the quilt in itself is scrappy as well. And then this nice white border kind of separates from the rest of the quilt, and it makes it okay that the binding's scrappy again, because you have that area that breaks up between the really busy quilt and the busy border binding as well. Now for batting could add a bit of price to your quilt as well, right? So it really depends on the type of batting that you like to purchase. Mine, I feel like is probably a little mid-range. I typically get the I think it's Warm and Natural from Walmart, and it can be, it's not as expensive as some that I've purchased from quilt shops. It's kind of right in the middle, but you can get pretty expensive with it. What I decided to do on this quilt was actually put an old flannel sheet inside of it. And let me tell you, I was a little bit worried about it because it was pretty stretchy. And this was the first time that I'd actually tried basting a quilt on my design board. I've seen a lot of people do it, and I'm like, okay, let's try it. And so I got the back up and the sheet up by spray basting it, and I ran out of spray. So I had to take it off and move to a table, and I had some fuse powder still from my Jenny's Countdown to Christmas box from last year still left over. So I decided to use that for the rest of it. I think I will stick to table basting quilts. It was nice to kind of give it a try and see if it's something that might work for me, but I'm definitely more comfortable doing my table basting method. The sheet inside of it was a little bit worrisome for me because it was so stretchy. I wasn't sure if it would work out, but I went ahead and went with it. And let me tell you, I might start doing this from now on, using a sheet inside. I live in Texas and it is so hot here, and the weight of these quilts can be a lot for quilting. And this one is so nice and lightweight and yummy. It'll be perfect for Christmas here, watching Christmas movies on the couch, because it isn't quite that cold yet coming up on December here. And it was really, really nice. It wasn't weighing me down as much when I was quilting it. I'm so happy with how it turned out. It is so much lighter than quilts I have made before. So think about giving it a try, putting a sheet in the center. I might have to start stocking up on sheets now. Now what I'm going to move into is walking you through one of the blocks on this quilt. It'll be a little bit of a quick tutorial to show you how this block comes together if you're interested in making a quilt like this. And if you are, I would love for you to hop into my Facebook group and share pictures of what you came up with this pattern. Let me show you how this block comes together, and then I'll bring you in closer after that to show you the quilting on this quilt. So I personally think the cuts here that we are working with are very easy, and I really like how this pattern is structured. For the cuts, we need cornerstones. So I just cut these from some leftover yardage that I had, and it was an ombre look, and I think it's going to be really fun how this comes together and is all from the same print, but will kind of change colors throughout the pattern, or shades, I should say. And then from my background fabric, we needed to cut some sashing. So I have some that is actually going to be on the block here. So that's these smaller cuts, and then the sashing that brings all the rows together. There is very minimal background cuts, but I do love patterns that are structured in sort of a scrappy way that take advantage of sashing and cornerstones to help tie everything together. So even though I have the ombre look here, I think having this uniform set of colors is really going to help bring this block together. Now, the block also calls for some 2.5-inch strips. I have some leftover jelly roll here that I'm going to use mainly for getting those main parts of this block together. So it's essentially a 4-patch. Whatever I can't build out of the jelly roll I have here, I did pull some yardage that I have left over from other projects that I'll weave in as needed. So to start the block, I'm going to take 2 kind of contrasting jelly roll strips. I'm being kind of relaxed on this pattern because I can often find myself spending a lot of time trying to pair together the right colors. But since this is a scrappy quilt, I'm not going to let myself get too hung up on it. So right here, I really like how the candy canes look with this kind of darker green print here. For me, when I say contrasting colors, that's often when I mean something lighter and something darker. But for this one, I am going to try to build in some that are just like very different sizes and prints. So I personally would be okay putting these 2 together. Now the tones are very, very similar in this. Those greens are very, very close. But since I have these larger polka dots and these smaller polka dots, I feel like it'll work for me because there is still a contrast in texture. Now, not everyone will feel that way, and that's okay, right? Like, we all are gonna find different things that we like in a quilt and in a project and how we want it to look. So I just wanted to point that out. If you see me putting something together like this and you're like, well, that's not very contrasting, that's very similar tones, that's why, because I'm looking at the polka dots being larger and smaller. So this quilt's going to be for me. I'm going to keep it in the house. I've noticed last year I don't have very many Christmas quilts. That we like to watch a lot of Christmas movies, and it starts getting chilly here, and it's nice to have a pretty Christmas quilt to cuddle up with while you're watching Christmas movies. So I'm just gonna look for this being something that makes me happy. So what we're going to do is cut these jelly rolls in half. Now, this pattern has really good notes on accuracy tips for jelly rolls, and then it also does discuss cutting these in half and making sure you measure to get everything right. I'm just going to cut it in half. Definitely follow the guidelines on here because they do want them to be certain lengths for when you sew them, but I'm just going to keep this easy, right? It's okay to do that sometimes. I promise you don't have to always be very, very rigid on things. Once we get these jelly rolls cut in half, we are going to place them right sides together and sew a 1/4 inch seam along them and then press them. Like I said, we're making a 4 patch, so this part is so easy. I'm gonna get these sewn and pressed, and we'll meet back here to take a look at how we put this block together. All right, so you can see here I have my 2 strips sewn. And now I'm going to be cutting them down to 2.5 inch strips segments. So I'm going to square off one side of the strip. And then this is a 2.5 inch wide ruler, so it makes it really easy for cutting these 2.5 inch cuts. So I'm going to go ahead and cut all of these strips, and then I'll show you what we do next with them. All right, so now that we have our little 2 patches sewn, we're gonna make sure we have contrasting sides all in order and sew our nice 4 patches. Now, because I pressed my seams to the darker color that I had here, they're going to nest together really nicely. So I'm gonna fold them together and sew a 1/4 inch seam across here and then press that seam again, and then we'll have our 4 patches, and this block will almost be finished. It comes together so nicely, and it is such a cute block. So I'm going to get all of these sewn up into 4 patches, and I'll meet back here and show you what we're doing next. All right, so now that I have my 4 patches all sewn, I'm going to lay out the block. So as you lay them out, you'll notice that you want the same color pointing into the center. So I chose to point the green into the center, so it's going to kind of form a square there. Then we need a cornerstone, and we need 4 of the smaller sashing that we cut from the background. So there's the block. So as you can see, I had enough to make 2 blocks from that one, well, from the 2 jelly roll strips that I used. So how I'm going to sew this block together is I'm going to bring one of the sashings on top of the block, right sides together, and sew a 1/4 inch seam. Do the same with the cornerstone and then the sashing. And after I sew all those, I'll press them and then add the next 4 square onto the sashing, the next sashing onto the cornerstone, and the next 4 square onto the other side of the sashing, and I'll press all of those. And then we'll take a look back here to see the exact directions that we're pressing these seams, because it's very important to bringing the block together. All right, so let's take a look at the pressing for this block. There are instructions in the pattern for pressing, and I just went ahead and followed those so that I could make it a little bit easier on myself and make sure all the pieces nest together to prevent some bulk. For the strip that has the 4 patches and the sashing in the middle, I press the seams into where the sashing is. For the piece that has the cornerstone and the 2 sashing on the outside, that seam is pressed out. And then the bottom 4 square with the sashing in the middle is pressed into the sashing as well. So this will just allow all the seams to nest and reduce bulk in this block. So I'm just going to, again, put right sides together, and then you see that these nest together really well. Everything will lay nice and flat. So I'll sew a 1/4 inch seam there, and then do the same with the bottom piece, sewing that on. And then after pressing it, the block will be finished already. All right, so here is the finished block. And again, I press the seams into the sashing just like the instructions showed. Isn't it just adorable? I love this block, and this fabric for the cornerstone is going to be so cute, just having that little snowflake peek out there. So I'm gonna go ahead and show you the other blocks that I got finished so far. I have this one that is the exact same fabrics as the first, but I also have a few others finished. So I'm just gonna show you what I have so far. And what is fun is some of these fabrics I have extras of. So this is the candy cane, it's the same here, so it'll help tie some of that together as well. And then I have this one. So I have a few of the blocks finished. To make the pattern the size that is indicated here, I need 36 total blocks. So I'm going to go ahead and finish those up. Then I'll show you how to bring them together using those other sashing cuts that we have. All right, so I have all of my blocks sewn. I have 36 of them, and there's just a nice variety here from all of my different Christmas fabric scraps that I have collected along the way. So I have all of these sewn, and what I'm going to be doing now is using the rest of my fabric here to bring the entire quilt top together. So I have some sashing fabric and some more cornerstones, and then a border here. So I'm going to use my design board to lay all these out because it is a lot of blocks, and this is going to be a fairly nice size quilt. So it'll just give me more room using my design board. I will put everything up, all of the sashing, the cornerstones, make sure I like it. I'm going to try not to spend too much time stressing over the placement of all these blocks. It'll probably be hard for me, but I'm going to try to just get a nice layout and not move everything around too much. I'll probably take a few pictures along the way just to make sure I don't have all of the dark blocks on one side and light on the other. I want a nice variety, but I also don't want to spend a lot of time stressing over it. I didn't spend a lot of time stressing over the placement of the fabrics in all these 4 patches, so I don't want to do that now. So I'm just going to get this all laid out, and then I'll be sewing all the rows together. It should come together fairly quickly now. The longest I think was definitely getting all these little 4 patches and then sewing all the sashing in. Once you get these larger blocks in place, the sewing I feel like comes together a little bit more quickly. So after I get the top done, I'm hoping to get this quilt all quilted up. I'm not sure how I'm going to quilt it yet. Usually it kind of comes to me after I see the top all together. I could do something really simple like just quilting it together with some straight lines, which is often my go-to. Maybe I'll feel inspired to do something a little bit different. We'll see. But I'll definitely show you the quilt top all finished before I move on to anything else. So here is what I did for quilting on this quilt. And I wanted it to kind of mimic this plaid-like design on the quilt, because not only did I have that kind of going on the back of the quilt with how I pieced the backing, but the front definitely kind of had a plaid feel to me. The pattern really reminded me, with all this Christmas fabric, of some wrapping paper. So I really wanted to follow along with that pattern. So I used just some light gray thread, and I just followed along this sashing. But what I did was I sewed about 1/4 inch on each side of the sashing seam on both sides. So I had 4 lines of stitching going along each direction of the sashing. I even followed that down onto the border of the quilt. So the stitches come off of the side of the quilt as well. You can see down at the border here, I was not sure if I should try and get 4 lines of stitching in. So what I did was I just left it as the two there along the seam, and I think it still flowed together really well. So that's how I quilted my quilt, and you can kind of see that on the back as well, and it looks pretty good there as well. So there is the quilt, and we'll have to see how well Kris did with her budgeting to see who won. We didn't really talk about what anybody would win. We just thought it would be kind of fun just to see who could piece the quilt together on the best budget. So I think I did pretty well. We'll have to talk about whether we think my white fabric should count into the budget or not, but everything else was all scraps for this quilt. So I think I did a pretty good job. What do you think? Let me know if it's something that you're going to try to do. If you're going to use this pattern, I would love to see how your blocks are turning out. If you want to share them with me on my Facebook page or on Instagram, you could tag me there. I would love to see it. And be sure, if you're here seeing my video first, to go check out Kris's. I will link hers down below, either in the description of this video or in the comments. You'll find it. So thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.